He didn't belong. At least that's what they decided the moment they saw him. Too calm, too confident, too black for first class. His presence alone sparked whispers, glances, assumptions. No outburst, no badge, no name was needed to provoke what came next. Just his existence. Before the plane touched down, he'd be stripped of dignity, denied breath, and left in an aisle like luggage someone regretted claiming. But when the world found out who he really was, everything, every policy, every lie, every smug command would begin to burn. What does it take for justice to finally speak louder than silence? Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And how do you think this story ends? Dr. Selim Vance moved through the jet bridge with the deliberate calm of someone used to being underestimated. The hiss of compressed air from the aircraft door and the muted hum of flight attendants greeting passengers filled the corridor as he approached the entrance to Flight 312 bound for Geneva. Selim, in his late 40s, wore a tailored slate gray blazer over a dark button-up shirt, his lean frame upright with disciplined posture. From the strap of his sleek leather satchel hung a diplomatic identification badge, its polished gold seal catching the overhead lighting as he stepped into the aircraft. A quiet greeting from the gate agent still echoed behind him. "Have a good flight, Dr. Vance." His nod in return had been brief and unassuming. Inside the cabin, the contrast between coach and first class was stark. Soft ambient lighting glowed above plush leather seating arranged in wide, private pods. A glass of orange juice with a thin slice of blood orange balanced on the rim waited at each table. The scent of fresh lemon and sandalwood diffused in the air vents. Selim's eyes quickly scanned seat numbers. His was 2A window side, just one row behind the cockpit bulkhead. He moved with ease down the aisle, trailing the soft sound of his polished shoes over the carpet, until a sharply voiced interruption cut through the cabin's serenity. "Excuse me, sir, first class is for premium ticket holders only." Selim stopped mid-step. In front of him stood a flight attendant in her mid-50s, tall, stiff-backed, with a coiled bun of auburn hair and pale green eyes that fixed on him with skepticism. Her name tag read Cheryl M. Her hand subtly extended across his path, halting his progress. Selim blinked. "Yes," he said calmly, "this is my seat, 2A." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Her tone wasn't courteous. It was loud, public. Passengers in rows 1 and 2 turned their heads. One man lowered his newspaper. A woman in 1B adjusted her sunglasses just enough to watch without being obvious. Selim felt the shift. The air had grown heavier. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, withdrew the folded boarding pass, and handed it to Cheryl. She took it quickly, looked down, and frowned. She said. "There must be a mistake in the system." She paused, then turned to speak into her earpiece. "Can you recheck 2A? Something's off here." The younger flight attendant behind her, clearly less seasoned, glanced at the boarding pass in Cheryl's hand. She hesitated. "That's a confirmed first-class seat," she said softly. Cheryl shot her a warning look. "Just double-check it." She turned back to Selim. "Sir, please step aside while we verify this." Her voice had the tone of a mother correcting a child. "This won't take long." Selim didn't move. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Cheryl pursed her lips. "You're not listed in the upgrade list. That seat's typically reserved for platinum-tier travelers. I've never seen your name." Selim raised an eyebrow, his patience thinning. "It's not an upgrade. It was purchased, full fare, government rate." "We'll look into that," she replied, gesturing him aside with a wave that might as well have been a dismissal. "Please move so we can finish boarding." People were watching now, openly. The man in 2C, who had just stored his carry-on, turned and smirked at Selim. "Maybe someone bumped you," he said, as if joking. Cheryl's radio clicked. "We've confirmed a last-minute reassignment," she said after listening. "Sir, your seat has been reassigned to 32E. You'll find it in the economy cabin." Selim blinked slowly. "That's a mistake. I paid for 2A." Cheryl handed him his boarding pass with an edge of condescension. "Talk to customer service once we land. But for now, you'll need to move." Was I the only reassignment, he asked, or just the only one who looks like me? Cheryl's eyes narrowed. Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to involve the captain. I'm trying to be polite. A hush fell over the cabin. The younger flight attendant shifted uncomfortably behind her. Selim could have resisted. He could have made a call, pulled rank, cited his clearance level. But doing that here, in front of these people, would only confirm the narrative Cheryl wanted, that he was difficult, defiant, out of place. Without a word, he nodded once, picked up his bag, and turned. The walk back down the aisle felt longer than it should have. He passed premium economy, then coach, past rows filled with families, college students, tourists with oversized headphones. At row 32, he stopped. Middle seat, 32E. The man at the window sighed loudly and didn't move to help. The woman on the aisle scowled and barely shifted. Selim slid into the narrow space with effort. His knees touched the seat ahead. He sat still in 32E, his spine upright, resisting the seat's crude curve as if it were trying to conform him to a role he'd never agreed to. The woman in 32D shifted toward the aisle with an exaggerated sigh, arms crossed over her chest, a deliberate inch of space separating her from him. The man at the window clicked away at his laptop, headphones over his ears, immersed in whatever world he could escape to. No one looked at Selim now. They didn't need to. The cabin had already reached its verdict. Back in first class, the man now occupying seat 2A stretched his legs and tugged at the cuffs of his ivory blazer. He was young, mid-30s at best, with sun-bleached hair and an unearned confidence that filled the space like cologne. Carter Lane, a hedge fund executive with an aggressive portfolio and a louder personality, had casually accepted the reassignment without question. He didn't know whose seat it had been, and he didn't care. He had smiled when Cheryl told him the upgrade was a courtesy extended to valuable clients. She hadn't explained what or who made it available. He hadn't asked. Instead, he reclined his chair, sipped from a chilled glass of bourbon, and complimented Cheryl on her professional judgment. She had responded with a smile, one more genuine than the one she had used earlier, and adjusted his blanket with meticulous attention. Meanwhile, in coach, Selim tried to focus on the in-flight magazine, its glossy pages filled with ads for luxury watches, ski resorts, and private lounges, ironic in their irrelevance. The words blurred. His breathing remained steady, but beneath his calm exterior, a slow burn began to take root. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something more insidious. The familiar ache of forced silence, of knowing that a protest, no matter how measured, would only validate their suspicion, that he didn't belong where he had once sat. He closed the magazine. A few rows behind him, a teenager whispered to his friend, both of them giggling behind Ray's phones. Selim caught his name being mispronounced once, then again, followed by the unmistakable shudder sound of a photo being taken. The boy didn't even try to hide it. 2 hours into the flight, a junior flight attendant approached with a drink cart. Her badge read Lauren, her demeanor far softer than Cheryl's. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, the first to address him since he'd been forced back. Selim looked up. Her eyes met his, then drifted briefly toward the diplomatic badge, half tucked beneath his jacket lapel. "Water," he said simply. "No ice." Lauren poured it silently, her eyes flicking toward Cheryl, who was now standing just behind the curtain separating first class. The moment her gaze caught them, Lauren stiffened and moved on without another word. Selim sipped his water slowly, letting it settle his stomach, though it did nothing for the tightness in his chest. The flight's dinner service followed. Chicken or pasta, served in heat-sealed trays, tasteless and dense. Selim declined. His appetite had left him somewhere between row 14 and 23, just after the murmurs had started. When he did try to close his eyes and rest, the light overhead refused to dim properly, and the man beside him, now sleeping, leaned into his space with every turbulence bump. Cheryl passed once, heading toward the rear. Her eyes didn't fall on him, but her voice, airy and condescending, floated clearly enough over the row. "We're happy to help those who ask nicely." She laughed lightly at the end, but it wasn't humor, it was control. The kind that flaunted power in small, humiliating doses. Selim's mind drifted to Geneva, to the conference waiting for him, where he would present new data on epidemic readiness, standing beside global dignitaries and specialists who addressed him as Dr. Vance, not as a disruption to protocol. He thought of the younger staffers who shadowed him for inspiration, not suspicion. But here, in seat 32E, none of that mattered. Here, the world didn't know who he was, and worse, didn't care. He adjusted his collar, pressed the back of his head against the seat, and stared at the ceiling panel. The air vent above him hissed, louder than necessary. He reached up and twisted it off. The overhead bins rattled gently with the plane's vibration. From behind, a voice cut the silence. First class must be running charity these days. It was quiet but intentional, spoken just loud enough for Selim to hear, followed by a muffled chuckle. Another voice, a deeper one, responded, "Yeah, well, maybe he'll be grateful. Some folks forget where they're supposed to be." The conversation trailed off, punctuated by the unmistakable pop of a soda can being opened. Selim didn't turn around. He couldn't afford to. His grip on the armrest tightened briefly, then loosened. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and detached. "We'll begin our descent into Geneva in approximately 90 minutes. Weather is clear, temperature at landing is 71 degrees. Selim glanced at his watch, mentally calculating the remaining time, not just in miles, but in endurance. He was a man who had survived war zones, political sabotage, and viral outbreaks. But here, on this aircraft, surrounded by silent passengers and willfully blind crew, he was defenseless. Not because he lacked authority, but because he'd been stripped the chance to use it. 30 minutes later, Cheryl returned. Her steps were measured, her expression unreadable. She stopped 3 rows short of where he sat, leaned into a seat to whisper something to a colleague, and then turned. Her gaze found him, not by accident this time. Her smile was thin, cold. "Hope everything's comfortable back here," she said, loud enough to be heard 2 rows in either direction. Selim didn't respond. She walked away, her heels clicking with satisfaction. He had stopped checking his watch. Every glance only reminded him that there were hours left in the air, hours in a seat not meant for someone of his build or bearing. The occasional bump of turbulence had been tolerable, until now. Without warning, the aircraft dropped several feet in a sudden air pocket, the kind that makes hearts leap into throats. Passengers gasped, a few yelped, and Selim, who had just slightly leaned forward to adjust his tray table, was thrown forward by the jolt. His head snapped down, slamming against the raised plastic edge of the tray. A dull thud echoed from his row, followed by the sharp metallic clang of a loose latch giving way. His water cup tipped and splashed down the front of his shirt as his body jerked sideways, shoulder hitting the armrest, breath catching in his throat. The pain was immediate, radiating from his brow down to his cheekbone. He blinked hard, dazed, disoriented by the sudden impact. His vision clouded momentarily, with sharp flashes of white. The woman seated beside him gasped, pulling away with a startled jolt. "Oh my God, are you all right?" she said, her voice tense but concerned. Selim tried to straighten, but a wave of nausea pulsed through his stomach. He groaned under his breath, pressing a palm to his forehead. A small trickle of blood began to form at the hairline, barely noticeable in the dim light, but enough to sting. He tried to speak, but the words snagged behind the weight of his dizziness. The passenger across the aisle hit her call button and turned around to flag the nearest flight attendant. "Excuse me, someone needs help over here." Her voice was sharp, urgent. From the front of coach, Cheryl Markham appeared, her stride brisk but face blank. She reached their row, looked down at Selim, who was now slouched slightly, eyes struggling to focus, then turned to the woman. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked flatly. "He hit his head," the woman said, pointing to Selim's soaked shirt and dazed expression. "He looks like he's about to faint." Cheryl looked at Selim, then back at the woman, her mouth curled into something almost dismissive. "He's fine," she said, already reaching into the seat back in front of Selim. "He's just having a dramatic moment." The air around them shifted as heads turned toward the exchange. Cheryl's voice wasn't loud, but it carried with a tone that dared anyone to challenge her. She pulled a sick bag from the seat pocket and, with a flourish, tossed it into Selim's lap. The paper crackled as it landed on his shirt, still damp from the spilled water. "If you're going to be sick, please use this," she added, voice lined with faux concern. Selim blinked again, his jaw clenched tightly as the fog in his head slowly began to lift. The ache throbbed now, a deep, pulsing thud at the top of his skull. He touched his hairline and winced, fingers coming away faintly red. The woman beside him was aghast. "Aren't you going to get him medical help?" she asked, incredulous. Cheryl stepped back, folding her arms. "We're over the ocean. There's no place to land, and he's conscious. Protocol says we observe unless there's a serious emergency." "He just slammed his head on the tray, and he's sitting up, breathing, speaking," Cheryl retorted, though Selim hadn't yet spoken a full sentence. "Unless someone here is a certified medical professional willing to take responsibility, we won't escalate." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. From across the aisle, a man raised his voice. "I'm a paramedic," he said cautiously. "I can check him, if that's okay with him." Selim nodded faintly, grateful for the offer. Cheryl exhaled through her nose. "Fine, but you're liable for anything you do. Just be quick." She turned on her heel and strode back up the aisle, the finality of her footsteps leaving no doubt that she considered the matter closed. The paramedic, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and weathered hands, reached over. "Sir, I'm just going to shine a light in your eyes, all right?" Selim nodded again. The flashlight clicked, and the beam passed from one eye to the other. "Your pupils are responsive," he said, "but you've got a small cut and some swelling. If you feel dizzy, nauseous, or start seeing spots, you need to report it immediately." "Already dizzy," Selim said, his voice hoarse. "It'll pass. You should be monitored." "I know," Selim muttered, more to himself than to the medic. As the man returned to his seat, Selim adjusted in place, trying to find a position that eased the pressure behind his eyes. The sick bag still sat in his lap, its presence an insult disguised as assistance. The woman beside him folded it and placed it in the seat back without a word. "That was uncalled for," she murmured. Selim didn't respond. His pride was battling his pain, each feeding the other, until both threatened to consume what was left of his dignity. Every moment since boarding had chipped away at him. But this, the silence that followed a blow to the head, the dismissal of visible injury, the tone of mockery in Cheryl's voice, this was a new kind of low. Not just humiliation, but danger dressed as indifference. In the front cabin, Cheryl chatted with Carter Lane, whose drink had been refilled during the turbulence. "What's going on back there?" he asked casually. Cheryl shrugged. "Some guy got lightheaded. Think he's regretting whatever upgrade he tried to sneak into. Coach does that to people." Carter chuckled, unconcerned. "Glad I'm up here. Can't imagine roughing it like that." Cheryl smiled, proud of her efficiency. "We do our best to make sure our loyal flyers are protected from surprises." As she turned back toward the galley, she didn't mention the injury, nor did she file a report. In her mind, Selim's moment had already passed, written off as an inconvenience not worth documentation. The pain at his temple was sharp now, not the throbbing dull ache it had been before, but a more pressing discomfort that sent intermittent pulses through the right side of his skull. He blinked slowly, trying to push back the fogginess that returned every few minutes, like a tide he couldn't hold back. Sweat beaded lightly along his brow, and although the cabin's air was cool, a warmth spread across his face and neck, unnatural and worrying. Beside him, the woman who had earlier expressed concern shifted again, glancing his way with increasing worry. She leaned toward him, voice low but urgent. "You're not looking good. Are you dizzy still?" Selim nodded, once barely. "Hard to breathe," he said, the word slower than he intended. His chest rose with more effort now, shallow, drawn-out inhales that failed to satisfy. His hand trembled as he reached for the call button. The faint chime above his seat lit the small bulb, but no one came. The woman beside him pressed her own call button, more forcefully this time. Across the aisle, the same paramedic who had offered assistance earlier looked up from his seat. He unbuckled, leaned forward, and watched, waiting for someone from the crew to appear. Moments later, Cheryl approached, her expression tight with disapproval. "Can I help you?" she asked, already irritated. "He's still not okay," the woman in 32D said firmly. "He says he can't breathe properly." Cheryl's eyes flicked to Selim, who now sat slouched slightly, his chest visibly laboring for air, skin pale under the thin cabin light. "I see," she said flatly, tone devoid of concern. "Well, there's not much I can do, unless he's unconscious." "That's ridiculous," said the woman. "Get a medical kit. Something. You need to check his oxygen level." From behind them, a new voice joined the conversation. "I'm a nurse," the woman in 33C said, rising for her seat. "Can I examine him?" Cheryl raised her hand. "That won't be necessary. This is now a security protocol matter." "A security what?" the nurse asked, frowning. "He's having trouble breathing. That's medical." "Ma'am," Cheryl said, placing her body between the nurse and Selim's row. "For safety, we cannot allow passengers to provide medical care without formal clearance. You could be held liable if anything goes wrong." "He could stop breathing if we don't act," the nurse replied, her voice sharpened by urgency. Cheryl didn't move. "I'll notify the captain," she said, and with a turn of her heel, she left without granting access or offering aid. Inside the first-class galley, Cheryl found Doug Kipley, the flight's operations manager, reviewing a manifest on his tablet. His tie was loosened, eyes weary from what had already been a taxing flight. "We've got a situation in coach," Cheryl said, arms folded. Doug didn't look up. "Another complaint. Same passenger. Vance. The guy we reassigned. He's claiming he can't breathe now." "Claiming?" Doug asked, raising an eyebrow. "He's still upright. Talking. Just enough of a problem to create a liability without giving us cause to divert. Should I pull a kit?" Cheryl asked. Doug shook his head. "No, that opens a paper trail. Last thing we need is this showing up in a report if he's fine by landing." "He's sweating and slurring. There's a nurse asking to help." "Tell the nurse it's an internal protocol matter. Say we're consulting with ground control. I'll log it as disruptive passenger fatigue. That lets us write it off without escalation." "Got it." Doug leaned in closer. "No incident report. Nothing formal unless he codes. We treat this like noise." Cheryl nodded, satisfied. They both knew the game. Underplay, deflect, move on. Back in row 32, Selim had slumped further, his chin now resting closer to his chest, breath rattling with effort. The nurse stood a few feet away, arms crossed, clearly agitated by the lack of response. The paramedic, now standing, had approached again. "You need to let us check his vitals," he said, voice directed to a younger attendant who had quietly approached in Cheryl's absence. She glanced around, uncertain. "We've been told not to intervene without management's directive. Management's going to be managing a corpse if they don't act," he snapped. "He's showing signs of a possible concussion and now respiratory distress. That's a red flag." The attendant looked back toward the galley curtain, torn between duty and authority. She didn't move. Selim's world was narrowing. The sounds around him blended together into a distant murmur, like waves crashing far from shore. His vision darkened at the edges, and he gripped the armrest with what strength he had left. He tried to lift his head, but couldn't. His body had become sluggish, uncooperative. He was aware distantly that people were watching, that voices were rising. He was aware of helplessness, of being studied like a malfunctioning object rather than a human being. He had sat in rooms with heads of state, had negotiated global health agreements, had stood before world leaders with charts that predicted outcomes decades in advance. And here, on this plane, he couldn't even stand up for himself. A few rows away, a teenage boy aimed his phone towards Selim and took another picture. The screen lit his face briefly in the darkness. His parents said nothing. Cheryl returned and leaned over the seat back to peer at Selim. "Sir," she said, her tone sharper than necessary, "are you able to sit upright?" Selim didn't respond. Cheryl looked to the attendant who had frozen earlier. "No more medical offers. We've got this under control." She handed the attendant a slip of paper with a code scrawled in ink. "Make sure this gets to the purser before landing. No medical declaration. No logs." It's already flagged." "Understood," the attendant replied, her eyes still locked on Selim's labored breathing. Back in the cockpit, Doug radioed ground control. His voice was casual. "Minor passenger fatigue. No deviation required. Maintain course." "Copy that," the ground officer replied. "Any onboard medical deployment?" "Negative," Doug said. "Monitoring only." She turned slowly, placing a hand gently on his forearm. "Dr. Vance," she whispered, concern laced in her voice. "Sir, can you hear me?" He did not respond. His skin was pale now, flushed faintly around the ears, but growing cooler to the touch. She looked across the aisle to the paramedic who had already attempted to intervene twice before. His expression darkened instantly as he rose from his seat. "He's out," he said firmly, reaching across the armrest. "He's not just dizzy anymore, he's unconscious." The murmur began slowly, then spread. Row by row, heads turned. Some passengers leaned sideways to glimpse what was happening. Others rose slightly in their seats. Whispered speculation took hold. "What's wrong with him? Wasn't he sick earlier? Is he having a stroke?" The woman from 33C, the nurse, stood again. "He needs oxygen and a full check. Now," she called down the aisle. "This is a medical emergency." But no one from the crew appeared. The flight attendant assigned to the mid-cabin remained frozen, hesitant, her eyes darting between the curtain separating first class and the rows behind her. She had heard Cheryl's directive clearly. She had been instructed not to interfere. Still, the nurse's voice grew louder. "He's non-responsive. We don't know how long. We need to move him, elevate his legs, check his pulse and airways." Passengers around them began pressing their call buttons, one by one, the chimes echoing through the cabin like an alarm no one had truly heard before. Still no response. The nurse bent down to Selim's side, placed 2 fingers against his carotid artery, and nodded once. "Pulse is weak, but it's there," she said. "But his breathing shallow. His airway could be compromised." The paramedic kneeled beside her. "We need an airway kit. We need crew permission to move him. This is their jurisdiction." His words were clipped, urgent. He looked toward the front of the cabin where Cheryl had last disappeared behind the curtain. Nothing. No one came. The inaction only amplified the tension in the air. Toward the rear of the cabin, a teenage boy seated beside his snoring father leaned forward in his seat, holding up his phone. He aimed it down the aisle, capturing the scene unfolding around Selim. The nurse's hands, the paramedic's focused face, the growing crowd of concerned passengers. He zoomed in on Selim's still form and took a photo. He typed quickly, fingers tapping over his screen with a practiced rhythm, then hit send. The caption read, "Dude passed out after being dragged to the back. First class kicked him out hard. Hashtag Flight 312, hashtag WTF." Within seconds, the post began to spread. 5 likes turned to 15, then hundreds as flight Wi-Fi transmitted the image to social media accounts around the globe. 1 retweet became 10, then a trending topic. The post began to circulate with hashtags questioning racism, airline negligence, and first-class injustice. Influencers picked it up. Anonymous accounts amplified it. Passengers on the plane, watching the drama unfold, began checking their feeds, connecting the unfolding real-time crisis to the image now circling the world. Still, no one from the flight crew responded. Cheryl had not reappeared, nor had Doug Kipley. The airline's protocol had frozen the cabin in a state of bureaucratic paralysis. The paramedic shook his head. "We don't have time for permission," he muttered. He looked at the nurse. "We're lifting him." They worked in tandem, carefully releasing Selim's seatbelt and sliding him forward. His body was heavier than expected, limp, with no reflexes or resistance. They laid him across the aisle floor. The nurse supported his head with a folded jacket, her hands trembling as she checked again for signs of obstruction in his airway. "Still breathing," she said, "but he needs oxygen now." Finally, another flight attendant approached, younger, visibly nervous, holding a sealed medical kit in her hands. I brought this," she said. The paramedic grabbed it instantly. "Thank you." He cracked open the case, pulled out an oxygen mask, and fixed it to Selim's face. If he was out for more than 5 minutes without this, we're dealing with potential hypoxia, he said grimly. He needs to be monitored the rest of the flight. The nurse nodded, whispering softly to Selim. Come on, stay with us. You're not done yet. Around them, passengers watched in stunned silence. Some stood, some remained seated, but none interrupted. They were witnesses, now not just to a medical crisis, but to a chain of deliberate decisions that had led to this moment. A woman in row 28 whispered, they left him to collapse. They saw it happening. A man beside her nodded, adding, he tried to get help earlier. They just walked away. Another voice, softer but clearer than the rest, spoke from row 30. They didn't care because of who he was or who they thought he wasn't. Up front, Cheryl was finally summoned by an urgent knock from a junior crew member. She emerged, composed, clipboard in hand. When she reached the scene and saw Selim on the floor, eyes closed behind the oxygen mask, she didn't rush forward. Instead, she scanned the scene with clinical detachment. What's going on here? She asked. The nurse responded first. He lost consciousness. We had no help. You ignored our earlier warnings. I was following procedure, Cheryl replied. He wasn't declared a medical emergency. He couldn't breathe, the paramedic snapped. He passed out because you delayed care. Cheryl's face stiffened. You were told that this was a non-incident. The nurse stood up. And now it's an incident. So what are you going to do about it? Cheryl didn't answer. Instead, she turned to the attendant who had delivered the kit. Who authorized that? No one, the young woman whispered. He looked like he was dying. We'll speak after landing, Cheryl said coldly, then turned back toward the galley. The moment she disappeared again, the nurse shook her head. She's covering herself. This will be buried if we don't say something. The paramedic looked around. It's not buried anymore. It's already online. He held up his phone, showing the trending post. People know. She had been the one who brought the medical kit, who chose to act against orders. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, not from fear of the situation, but from the weight of what she had defied. She watched the rise and fall of Selim's chest, the sweat pooling beneath his jawline, and she knew he wasn't stable. Her instincts, her training, told her that more had to be done, that the kit wasn't enough. He needed consistent oxygen flow, a medical landing plan, a live transmission with ground medics. But her chain of command, Cheryl, was about to make sure none of it happened. From the forward galley, Cheryl returned, clipboard in hand and an unflinching scowl already forming across her face. She stepped deliberately past the curtain that divided first class from coach, her heels clicking a strict rhythm against the floor. Her eyes locked on Samantha first, then to the gathering around Selim's unconscious form. Her voice, when it came, was low but razor-sharp. What exactly do you think you're doing? Samantha looked up, startled but defiant. He lost consciousness. We had to act. I got the kit. Cheryl stepped closer, her posture like a blade. You weren't authorized. I said, observe only. That kit should have stayed sealed unless command issued it. He stopped breathing, Samantha replied, trying to keep her voice even. There was no time for protocol. He's still not stable. You listen to me, Cheryl snapped, taking one half step into Samantha's space, voice now an icy whisper. I've been on this job 18 years. You don't make those calls. You don't play hero. You don't stick your neck out for someone who doesn't belong up here. The words hung in the air like toxic gas. Samantha's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her eyes flicked down to Selim, still lifeless on the floor, then back to Cheryl. Are you saying he deserves this? Cheryl didn't respond directly. Instead, she stepped around the body toward the paramedic and nurse. Return him to his seat. We're not landing. This is being monitored. The paramedic rose to his feet, furious. He should be stabilized on a stretcher. He passed out in flight. What the hell kind of operation are you running? Cheryl ignored him and pulled her radio from her belt. Cabin to cockpit. Confirm status. The radio buzzed. A dry male voice answered. This is the captain. Cheryl spoke calmly, as though nothing were wrong. Request status on incident protocol. Passenger regained consciousness. No escalation needed. Confirm. A pause. Then, maintain altitude. No deviation. Maintain schedule. Cheryl nodded, pocketed the radio, and turned to Samantha. Now you've heard it from command. Secure the cabin. Passengers around them remained silent, but the silence now felt angry, crowded with disbelief. The nurse looked up. He hasn't regained consciousness. That's a lie. Cheryl didn't blink. Unless you want to be detained upon landing for interfering with an FAA-protected security response, I suggest you return to your seat. The nurse's jaw dropped. Are you threatening me? I'm giving you your last chance to stay out of something above your clearance. With a last look of frustration and helpless rage, the nurse stood, returned to her seat, and folded her arms tight across her chest. The paramedic remained crouched, one hand lightly resting on Selim's shoulder. I'll stay here, he muttered, just so he's not alone. Cheryl didn't fight him on it. She turned again to Samantha, who still hadn't moved. You'll be written up for this, she said coldly. You violated emergency response procedures and undermined a superior. Samantha's mouth was dry. I followed my conscience, she said, and I'd do it again. Cheryl's expression didn't change. Then you'd better pray he doesn't die, because you'll carry that too. As Cheryl retreated toward the galley, Samantha stood like a statue beside the jump seat. Her hands clenched into fists, heart pounding in her ears. She had watched lives saved before, had been part of rescues and CPR teams in training simulations. But never had she seen someone so intentionally denied the basics of care. Never had she been told not to help someone simply because it might inconvenience the schedule or, worse, shine a light on a mistake. The plane lurched again, another small patch of turbulence, just enough to cause a ripple of discomfort. Selim's body, still lying partially across the narrow aisle, shifted slightly. His arm slid, limp, toward the floor, fingers grazing the metal track that ran between the seats. Samantha took a step forward instinctively, then stopped. Cheryl's threat still echoed in her mind. Don't stick your neck out for someone who doesn't belong. That sentence had burned itself into her, a brand she couldn't remove. She stared down at Selim, breathing shallowly through the mask she had given him, and felt shame crawl up her spine. In the cockpit, the captain sat stone-faced, hands on the controls, eyes fixed forward. He had heard the brief exchange, seen the flag passenger report come through his screen. A note next to the name Vance Selim read, "Seat reassignment, medical disputed, NO diversions." His job, he reminded himself, was to deliver the plane on time and maintain FAA protocol. He didn't know the full story, didn't want to know. Every diversion cost thousands. Every incident meant paperwork, questions, responsibility. Better to fly the plane and let the rest unfold below the clouds. Back in coach, the passengers near row 32 sat stiffly, many pretending to sleep, others pretending to be engrossed in films. But none were fooled. They knew something had gone terribly wrong. The man who had been seated upright hours earlier, forcibly reassigned despite protest, now lay unconscious, his status unacknowledged, his humanity disregarded. The teenage boy who had posted the photo earlier watched his phone with growing fascination. The post had exploded. Thousands of likes, hundreds of retweets, and now tagged accounts from news outlets, celebrities, and activists. The caption had changed. People were calling for accountability, demanding names, screenshots, explanations. Photos of Cheryl had surfaced, taken by another passenger in first class, showing her smiling next to Carter Lane. The contrast between that moment and the image of Selim unconscious on the floor struck a nerve with the public. The intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice came over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed in Geneva. For your safety, please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. There was a slight pause, then his voice returned, more guarded. Medical personnel will be boarding the aircraft momentarily. Please do not interfere. The cabin returned to silence. From her position near the forward galley, Cheryl Markham smoothed the front of her uniform and slipped her clipboard under her arm. She did not look back toward Selim. Instead, she whispered something into her radio and waited for the signal to open the front door. Samantha, standing at the rear of coach, fidgeted with the cuffs of her sleeves, heart pounding. She watched the nurse place a steadying hand on Selim's chest, her other hand raised in signal to the emergency crew. She had done everything she could, and still it felt like nothing. The front door clicked open with a hiss, and two uniformed paramedics stepped onto the aircraft, pushing a compact stretcher between them. Behind them, a Swiss border security officer followed. Cheryl met them with her usual formal tone. Passenger collapsed mid-flight. We monitored vitals. No known health conditions declared. He refused initial assistance. The nurse behind her scoffed loudly. He didn't refuse anything. He begged for help and was ignored. Cheryl's eyes narrowed. He wasn't declared unstable at the time. We acted according to protocol. The paramedics ignored both women and pushed quickly down the aisle, maneuvering around tight seats and frozen passengers. One knelt beside Selim, immediately checking his pulse and pupil response, while the other set up a monitor. "BP's dropping," said one. "He's hypoxic. Let's bag him." The paramedic unhooked the ineffective mask and replaced it with a manual resuscitator. "He's critical. We need to move now." As they loaded Selim onto the stretcher, his satchel, previously tucked beneath his seat, was retrieved by the paramedic. It opened slightly in the transfer, and the contents spilled partially out. A blue leather folder slid to the floor. The nurse picked it up, about to hand it over, when her eyes caught the golden seal embossed across the front. It read, "United States Department of Health and Human Services, Federal Advisor." She blinked, stunned. Beneath it, visible through the clear plastic inside the folder, was a series of credentials marked with classified insignias, including clearance tags from the World Health Organization. Her hand trembled. "You need to see this," she told the lead paramedic. He glanced at the badge, then whistled. "This guy's not just a passenger. He's a government official." The nurse handed the folder to Samantha, who stared at it for a long moment. Selim Vance, so quiet, so composed, so profoundly mistreated, was not only a high-ranking American medical strategist, but a confidential advisor on global disease security. His clearance was higher than that of most foreign diplomats. She turned the folder around to show Cheryl, who had just begun ushering passengers off the plane through the front cabin. "Look at this," Samantha said, stepping forward. "You dragged a federal advisor out of first class, ignored his medical crisis, and lied to ground control." Cheryl's face blanched for the first time since takeoff. She reached for the folder, but Samantha pulled it back. "You said he didn't belong up front. You said to leave him, that he was faking it." "We had no way of knowing," Cheryl began, but Samantha cut her off. "That's the problem. You didn't care to know." The border officer, who had overheard the exchange, took the folder gently from Samantha. "This changes everything," he muttered, signaling to his team. "This flight will be held. Nobody leaves until we debrief the crew." Cheryl stepped back, her expression cracking. "I followed protocol," she said again, quieter now, less certain. "He never identified himself." "He didn't have to," the nurse snapped. "You should treat every human like they matter, not just the ones who look like you." Outside on the tarmac, the stretcher carrying Selim was wheeled rapidly toward the waiting ambulance. The medics worked with efficiency, attaching monitors and 4 lines as they moved. The lead medic radioed ahead to the hospital. "We've got an unconscious male, late 40s, suspected TBI, low oxygen, unknown cardiac history. And he's federal. U.S. government. Clearance codes verified." Inside the ambulance, Selim's chest rose and fell under manual assistance. A heart monitor beeped steadily, but weakly. Every breath was a battle now. His body had done all it could to endure the flight, but now the real fight began. Back inside the aircraft, Cheryl was led to the galley by the Swiss officer. Samantha remained behind with the passengers, who now buzzed with disbelief. Word spread quickly. A man in row 34 pulled up Selim's name on his phone and found several news articles linking him to pandemic response initiatives, keynote addresses, and classified briefings to the United Nations. "He's someone big," the man whispered. "They treated him like trash." News agencies had already begun posting about the incident, thanks to the viral tweet and the growing flood of passenger testimonies uploaded mid-flight. photos of Selim lying unconscious had been juxtaposed with headlines about his role in stopping a viral outbreak in South America. Comment threads exploded. Hashtags multiplied. Calls for accountability thundered across platforms. The incident was no longer contained to Row 32. It had erupted across the world. The captain, still in the cockpit, received a direct message from airline headquarters. It was terse. Passenger Vance. Federal ID verified. Hold plane. Full investigation ordered. Pilot cooperation mandatory. He swallowed hard, looked at the co-pilot, and nodded grimly. This is going to get ugly. When corporate filings were cross-referenced, it was revealed that Airline Capital Trust held a 21% stake in Equinox Holdings, the conglomerate that owned the airline that operated Flight 312. The moment that connection was verified, the markets reacted like a body going into cardiac arrest. By morning in New York, Equinox Holdings stock dropped 17% in early trading. That slide turned into a cliff by midday. The trust, through legal counsel, issued a searing public statement. In light of the inhumane treatment of Dr. Selim Vance aboard Flight 312, and in alignment with our long-standing commitment to equity, health, and global ethics, Airline Capital Trust is initiating full divestment from Equinox Holdings, effective immediately. The statement spread like wildfire. News anchors repeated Selim's name on every major network. His picture, serene, professional, and dignified in his official headshot, contrasted violently with the image of him unconscious on the plane. How could someone so essential be treated with such disregard? Asked one anchor. What does this say about everyone else who lacks that title? Questioned another. The fallout deepened. On Capitol Hill, senators began calling for hearings. The FAA, facing immense pressure, launched an emergency audit of the airline's operations, particularly its in-flight medical protocols and internal complaint handling. Within hours, the FAA issued a record-setting penalty, $3.4 billion, citing willful negligence, gross misconduct, and failure to follow federal medical response protocol. The fine was not merely punitive, it was historic. Financial analysts said it could cripple Equinox for a generation. Meanwhile, inside Equinox's Manhattan headquarters, panic set in. Emergency meetings were called. PR teams scrambled to craft apologies. But the damage was already irreversible. Internal emails leaked to the press showed executives discussing Selim's unfortunate placement in first class and questioning how flag profiles had slipped past pre-boarding filters. Those emails, though couched in corporate jargon, revealed the deep systemic prejudice that had shaped the entire incident. Cheryl Markham, the lead flight attendant who had become the face of the scandal, was suspended without pay pending investigation. Her access badges were revoked. Her company email disabled. Doug Kipley, the onboard operations manager who had authorized no incident report, received the same treatment. Their photos and names circulated on the internet, some defending their actions under the banner of just following protocol, others calling them out for being the visible perpetrators of corporate racism. Public reaction was swift and unrelenting. Thousands of people boycotted the airline. Celebrities canceled endorsement deals. Partner companies pulled out of promotional contracts. One travel site announced it would remove the airline from its booking options. Within 24 hours, Equinox lost $11.8 billion in projected value. Investors fled. The CEO released a statement that fell flat, a mixture of corporate apology and damage control that only inflamed public anger. Selim's name trended globally for 36 hours straight. In Geneva, as he lay in the hospital, sedated and connected to a ventilator, international leaders began releasing statements. The Secretary General of the United Nations expressed grave concern. The President of the United States, after being briefed on the full scope of the situation, issued a televised response. Dr. Selim Vance is not only a citizen of exceptional service to our country, but also a symbol of what integrity, compassion, and knowledge can achieve on the world stage. What happened to him aboard Flight 312 is an abomination, an affront to justice, to dignity, and to humanity. There will be consequences. And there were. Behind closed doors, board members of Equinox scrambled to negotiate terms with Adelon Capital Trust. But the trust refused to speak with them directly. Instead, a representative released another statement. This is not merely a financial withdrawal. This is a moral reckoning. What Dr. Vance endured is not uncommon. What's uncommon is the power to change it. News outlets began running retrospectives on Sealam's career, how he predicted the COVID resurgence in Southern Europe, how he negotiated global vaccine distribution to low-income nations, how he trained task forces in high-risk zones, how he almost died of malaria in Uganda, yet returned to finish a sanitation project. These details painted a portrait not just of a victim, but of a man whose contributions had saved tens of thousands of lives. Every story that surfaced made Cheryl's flippant comment, "He never followed protocol," sound more grotesque. The nurse and paramedic who had helped Sealam were interviewed by European news outlets and praised for their courage. Samantha Graves, the junior attendant who had defied Cheryl, became a quiet hero. Her name was withheld in early reports, but once her identity was revealed, the public rallied behind her. A petition calling for her promotion garnered nearly 500,000 signatures. Interviewed briefly by Swiss reporters, she said only, "I did what I hoped someone would do for me, and I'll never regret it." Meanwhile, Doug Kipley was seen leaving Equinox's office with boxes in hand, dodging reporters, face pale. Cheryl remained silent. Her family home in New Jersey was surrounded by media vans, but she refused interviews. The airline, desperate to save itself, offered settlements to avoid lawsuits. Sealam's legal team, however, announced that litigation was not only underway, but that they intended to expose the company's internal training materials and email protocols, all of which, they claimed, reinforced a systemic pattern of discrimination and passive dehumanization. These protocols, designed under the guise of risk management, were riddled with coded language, phrases like verify luxury seating claims, observe emotional tone for escalation risk, and flag unorthodox ticket purchases. One section explicitly instructed flight staff to defer to first-class integrity, encouraging reassignment of suspicious profiles to economy unless verified by staff manager. These documents reached major outlets like the Washington Post, BBC, and Reuters within hours. What had once been whispered about in blogs and niche forums was now undeniable. The airline trained its crew to profile based on race, demeanor, and perceived socioeconomic mismatch. By the end of that week, 3 more whistleblowers came forward, one of whom had trained Cheryl Markham herself. "We were told not to say the word race, but everyone knew," the former training manager said during a live interview. "It was in the way we talked about passengers who got extra water, who got second glances. We were trained to protect the image of first-class comfort." A former purser added, "Cheryl was one of the most aggressive about it. She followed those manuals like scripture, and she made sure junior crew members fell in line." Back in New Jersey, Cheryl could no longer hide. After days of silence and failed PR shielding by the airline, she was served a subpoena at her home. Her attempts to deflect, claiming she was merely following procedure, collapsed under the weight of evidence, now flooding every network and courthouse. Subpoenaed not just for civil suits, but also for testimonies in criminal negligence inquiries, she was flown under escort to D.C., where a federal panel awaited her deposition. Cameras lined the courthouse entrance as Cheryl, now publicly disgraced, was ushered inside. Her face, once stone-cold in authority, now looked worn, defeated, thinner. Her legal team tried to block certain footage, but the judge ordered full review. In a sealed hearing room, she was forced to sit across from a screen playing cabin footage retrieved from both the airline's security cameras and bystander phones. She watched herself brush past Sealam's slumped figure, roll her eyes when a nurse tried to intervene, and toss a sick bag into his lap while passengers stared in disbelief. When the footage paused, she avoided eye contact with the board. "I didn't know who he was," she said quietly. "I thought he was pretending." One of the panelists, a woman with decades in civil rights litigation, leaned forward. "And if he had been no one, would that excuse it?" Cheryl said nothing. Outside the courtroom, protests had begun to swell. not just against Cheryl, not just against Equinox, but against the culture that allowed these behaviors to flourish unchallenged for years. Airline employees from other carriers began posting their own stories of profiling, their own regrets. Lawsuits piled up. Sealam's legal team, led by renowned civil rights attorney Helena Price, filed an expansive civil suit against Equinox for gross negligence, racial discrimination, and attempted cover-up. The suit included dozens of passenger affidavits and whistleblower statements. It also included a claim for systemic damages, seeking to force long-term operational change in airline procedures globally. During a televised press conference, Price stood before a row of microphones and delivered a blistering indictment. This was not just about one man in one seat on one flight. This was about a system that has silently ranked passengers by color, class, and assumption. Dr. Vance is not just a client. He is a symbol of who this country claims to be and who it still fails to protect. The lawsuits had a domino effect. Other law firms filed companion suits. International human rights organizations filed complaints to aviation authorities in Europe and Asia. Airline regulators in 5 countries announced joint investigations. Within 10 days, Equinox's operations were under review in over a dozen jurisdictions. Board members began to resign. A call for CEO removal gathered momentum. One shareholder memo leaked to the press read, "There will be no recovery while the old guard remains." Meanwhile, Sealam began to stir. After days of sedation, he regained partial consciousness. He could not speak yet, his throat dry and constricted from intubation, but his eyes opened, aware and calculating. Nurses informed him gently of what had happened. And as days passed, pieces of the outside world filtered in. His sister sat beside him, reading headlines aloud, describing the worldwide reaction, the collapse of Equinox, the countless voices raised in his name. He blinked slowly, once, then twice, tears sliding silently from the corners of his eyes. He had not chosen to become a symbol, but he had become one nonetheless. In an emergency board meeting at Equinox, executives tried desperately to salvage what remained. A proposal was floated to change company branding, remove key leaders, and issue settlement offers. But none of it felt sufficient. Every day brought new revelations, emails, videos, procedures, all pointing to a culture of concealed bias and performance optics. Cheryl, meanwhile, remained under intense scrutiny. Her public defenders had vanished. Her own union withdrew support. The union president said simply, "We do not stand with those who abandon compassion." Doug Kipley, her supervisor, gave a separate deposition and attempted to distance himself. Cheryl made the in-cabin call. "I approved based on her report. I never saw the passenger." His statement was contradicted by radio logs. His image joined Cheryl's on every headline. The recovery process was long, measured in the slow return of strength to Sealam Vance's limbs, the gradual recoordination of his speech, and the quiet reconciliation between mind and body after the trauma that left him unresponsive on a transatlantic flight. In the Geneva clinic where he had been cared for under round-the-clock supervision, Sealam sat upright for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, surrounded by doctors who offered both relief and warning. His neurological scans showed no permanent damage, but the stress on his heart and brain had been dangerously close to catastrophic. He listened carefully, absorbing every syllable, but his mind was already several steps ahead. He wasn't just thinking about recovery. He was thinking about purpose. By the time he returned to the United States, escorted privately by a government medical jet, the world had not forgotten his name. If anything, his story had grown louder, reaching classrooms, Senate floors, and even corporate boardrooms where leaders were being asked uncomfortable questions about their own institutions. As he stepped off the aircraft onto U.S. soil, camera crews were kept at a distance. But one boom mic caught the voice of a reporter shouting, "Dr. Vance, what do you want now?" He didn't answer immediately. He nodded to the security team and was driven in silence to his sister's home in Maryland. There, surrounded by family, he drafted a single-page statement that would be released the following morning. In it, he wrote, "Justice is not vengeance. It's correction. What happened to me is not unique. The pain was not mine alone. It belongs to everyone who has been ignored, profiled, diminished, or denied humanity. I do not seek punishment. I seek repair. Not for me, but for those who will come after me. If my voice has been heard, let it be a call to change how we treat people when the cameras aren't watching. Let it be a warning that silence is never safety, and compassion must not be conditional. The letter, typed in plain black font on an unembellished white page, went viral the same way the footage of his unconscious body had. But this time, it sparked a different tone. Editorials hailed his dignity, his refusal to respond with bitterness. Educators shared it with students. Activists used it to call for new standards, and the airline, still reeling from investigations, was forced to quote it in its own internal training sessions. But Selim's vision wasn't limited to speeches. He moved to act. Within 30 days of his return, Airline Capital Trust, his family's holding entity, announced the creation of the Wacth Initiative for Ethical Travel. Seeded with $50 million, the fund's mission was clear: enforce industry-wide reform on racial equity in aviation, sponsor audits of discriminatory practices, train flight staff in real-time empathy and cultural awareness, and partner with universities to build ethics modules into hospitality and travel education. Grants were offered to whistleblower protection programs, nonprofit watchdog groups, and mental health support organizations for airline staff willing to speak up. The initiative wasn't just punitive, it was corrective, structural, and hopeful. Selim refused to be a symbol that evoked only pain. He wanted to reshape the very environment that failed him. And slowly, it began to take effect. At Equinox Holdings, leadership had been gutted. The former CEO was replaced by a reformist outsider who immediately signed on to the Wacth Initiative and installed a new equity board. Entire divisions were overhauled. More than 100 employees, many of whom had expressed similar concerns in the past, were promoted into training and compliance roles. A new hotline was established. Anonymous reports were encouraged. Bonuses were tied to ethical benchmarks, not just efficiency. And Cheryl Markham? She was sentenced to 12 months of court-ordered service at the Summit Street Wellness Clinic in Newark, one of the community health centers that Selim had personally helped fund during the pandemic. At first, she resisted. On her first day, she stood in front of the glass doors wearing a faded jacket and no name badge, unwilling to walk in. She had told her lawyer she would never make it through the full term, but the court had given no option: work or jail. So she went inside. She answered phones, scheduled immunizations, mopped floors, and stocked supply closets. For the first week, no one recognized her. But slowly, as the staff began to connect her name to the scandal, the clinic's receptionist, a woman named Gracie, approached her one afternoon. "You're that flight lady, aren't you?" she asked. Cheryl didn't reply. "Dr. Vance used to volunteer here," Gracie added. "He paid for our generator when the power went out last winter." Cheryl stiffened. She had spent the last year justifying herself, blaming pressure, defending policy. She hadn't stopped to think about who he was, only what he represented: a disruption, a delay, a profile that didn't fit. That evening, after her shift ended, she wandered down the clinic hallway and paused at the donor wall. There, behind a sheet of clear acrylic, was Selim's photograph. He wore no tie in the image, just a white dress shirt and a smile that looked half exhausted, half sincere. Underneath, a plaque read, "For seeing us before we were visible." Something cracked in Cheryl then, not a collapse, but a quiet, internal unraveling. She sat in the hallway for over an hour, staring at the photo. When Gracie passed by again, Cheryl asked softly, "What else did he do here?" Gracie sat beside her. "He made time, even when he didn't have it." The conversation stayed with her. In the weeks that followed, Cheryl showed up earlier, stayed later. She stopped requesting assignments and started asking who needed help. She carried supplies, folded laundry, wrote cards for elderly patients, and once, when a young boy cried during a flu shot, she held his hand and smiled. She still didn't talk much, but she listened. And in that silence, something new began to grow. Months later, when Selim returned to the clinic for a quiet check-in visit, he recognized her immediately. They stood in the hallway, neither speaking for several seconds. Finally, Cheryl said, "I saw what I did. I see it now." Selim nodded. Seeing is a start. She lowered her head, and for the first time in her career, she did not defend herself. Outside, the world moved on, but not unchanged. Airlines around the globe adopted new ethics policies, many citing the Vance Initiative directly. Selim declined television offers and awards, choosing instead to mentor younger diplomats and health advocates. He published a book titled Altitude: What We Fail to See at 30,000 Feet, blending policy critique with personal memoir. It became a bestseller not for its outrage, but for its grace. In classrooms, his case became part of curriculum. In flight schools, his name was spoken with reverence. And in airports, those sprawling hubs of motion and anonymity, people began to look twice, not with suspicion, but with care. Passengers helped one another with luggage, asked for names instead of seat numbers. Flight attendants, some trained under the new protocols, learned to ask not just "What's your seat?" but "Are you okay?" Something had shifted. A culture once built on hierarchy and speed had been reminded, forcefully and permanently, of its duty to humanity. The end. Thanks for following the journey of unclaimed humanity. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I'd love to know, what did you think of the plot twists? Did any part surprise you? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it.